And may the Lord bless you this morning. We bring you greetings from the city of Indianapolis, Indiana, as well as from the country of Venezuela, where we just came back a day and a half ago. It's great to be here in Joplin. I was looking on the internet and discovered as I was looking at the college basketball rankings that they play basketball in Missouri. Do we have any Mizzou fans here today? We're looking forward to seeing how this unfolds in the next month, and we'll be rooting for Missouri as long as they don't conflict with some of our personal favorites. But we will look forward to see how this unfolds. It is a real honor, and I say this with all of my heart, to be with you today as we close the International Focus Week. I am humbled and honored to be part of this week and just to contribute a piece of what others have laid down as well through the classes, the chapel time. I'm especially thankful that this opportunity affords me the privilege to be accompanied by my wife Donna, our son Dawson, our daughter Deshay, who are with us, and she is she's actually a new student here at Ozark as of 2 weeks ago, so we're glad that she can be part of this environment, and thank you for the wonderful heart that you have for missions on this campus. As I said earlier, we just returned from Venezuela 2 days ago. We bring you greetings from the Christians who are on fire for the Lord, have a passion for spreading the gospel not only in their own country, but they're anxious to continue to push the gospel abroad into places of the world where perhaps we may not be able to go. Well, in light of the fact that it is the last day of our International Focus Week, and it is a small world, isn't it providential that today we celebrate in honor of a small world, Groundhog's Day. And if you've not had the opportunity to say Happy Groundhog's Day to the person beside you, why don't you take a moment and just remind them, Happy Groundhog's Day. And now you can bring your attention back up front. I asked Marcia earlier this week, please leave something for me to say because I know a lot of important things have already been said about Small World. And I trust that you are getting a grip on this theme. How many believe that it is a small world, and how many believe that it is a big world? How many lift up your hands if you believe that it is a small world getting smaller? Raise your hand if you believe that truth. How many believe that it's a big world getting bigger? Raise your hand. How many don't know? How many would say both are right? And there's probably a sense in which that is true. There is a real sense in which the world is getting bigger. I was listening to the radio back in the fall. On that particular day, the radio station was making the claim that the United Nations had just calculated on that particular day that the world population was now cresting over 7 billion people. October the 31st, 2011. That is a figure that is extremely hard for me to get my mind around. I was raised in a small town of 7,000 people. And if I do the calculations right, to get my little town up to the world population, you would have to multiply the population by 1 million times to get to the population of the world today. So it is a massive place, as it is also a massive universe. But not only is the world a massive world, this world that is massive is also, in a real sense, getting smaller, and some would say it's getting flatter. Information technology continues to grow and has created what we have termed today a global village. We're witnessing the death of a distance, and boundary lines are actually melting on the map. Thanks to internet, sermons can be heard round the world, as many other things can also be heard round the world. In the city of Indianapolis, where we drove in from yesterday, they're preparing for a football game that they anticipate this Sunday will be seen round the world. Somebody has suggested years back that actually we are only separated from any other person on the globe by a simple 6 persons. Facebook did a study on that this past fall, and now they have recalculated the distance between us and any other person on the globe, and now they're calculating that it's down to 4 people between us and any other person on the globe. We're much closer and much more connected than we could have ever imagined. Sometimes that doesn't work to our advantage. It's also been said that when America sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. Our economies, ecologies, and the politics are becoming ever increasingly interconnected. And how about the spread of diseases and infections? Who among us has not suffered from a computer virus that came from who knows where? Or on the other hand, if you've ever attempted to travel in the last couple of years, you realize how difficult it is to try to avoid the swine flu. Well, I'm not sure that I can give you a whole lot of information that is relatively new to you. What I would like to attempt to do this morning in the few minutes that we have is to share several stories that have been personal to us as we contemplate some of the realities of living in a small world that might be crucial to decisions that you and I are making today. So let's begin by the first reality. It really is a small world when the Lord is God. It really is a small world when the Lord is God. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 24, Jeremiah records the voice of the Lord as God speaks about the smallness of this universe. He says this in Jeremiah 23, 24, "Can anyone hide in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord?" In other words, God is saying, I'm not just a local deity. He is at the farthest stretch of the universe, and at the same time is as near as where you are seated right now. That is an incredible truth to comprehend when we contemplate the vastness of the universe. Somebody suggested that if you would like to do a very simple tour of our universe at the speed of light, this is what it might look like. Light travels, as you probably remember from high school science class, at the speed of 670,616,629 miles per hour. That's just a little bit faster than what we were driving, trying to stay under the speed limit out here to Missouri yesterday. If we could have traveled at that speed, we would have made a trip in just a little less than a split second from Indianapolis to here. To get to the sun, it would take you at the speed of light 8 minutes. If you wanted to leave our galaxy, the Milky Way, traveling at the speed of light, it would take more than 50,000 years to get to the end of the Milky Way. That's just our galaxy. Now you talk about, are we there yet? Just to get to the end of the galaxy, 50,000 years, but it goes beyond that. To reach the next galaxy, it would take 2 million years traveling at the speed of light. 10 billion years to get to the edge of the universe. And in the midst of this incredible universe, God says this, "Can anyone hide in secret places so that I cannot see him? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord?" It is a small world when the Lord is God. 5 years ago, while we were living in the country of Venezuela, our daughter Deshay needed to get out of the country and do a little bit of college visitation. And so in January, 5 years ago, we attempted to make some plans to come up and do some college visits. Our trip was delayed due to several different obstacles that were going on in the country and our family life at that time. And so we had to put the date back a little bit further. We finally grabbed a national airline headed out of Caracas, a Venezuelan airline going up to Florida late January. And on the plane, we were seated next to a Chinese man. I thought as we boarded the plane and sat next to him, nada que ver con este chino. We don't have anything in common. And I was ready to go to sleep because we had had a long weekend. We were tired. My daughter felt the same. But I realized that before I went to sleep, I better go to the bathroom. And the only way I was going to go to the bathroom was to get up over the top of the Chinese man. So I thought maybe I'll engage him in some small talk. I started to talk to this man, and I said, well, sir, do you happen to live in Venezuela? He said, yeah, I am Venezuela. My parents moved here from China years ago. I said, so where do you live today? He said, well, I came back to Caracas several years ago and raising my family there. And I said, so where did you end up in Caracas? He said, well, we ended up on the west side. I said, well, that's interesting. When we came to Venezuela, we also began living over on the west side of Caracas. I said, and beyond that, maybe you remember that over on the west side, there's a statue called La Estatua de la India. It's an Indian statue, and that's where we started to live when my wife and I started missions here. He said, oh, yeah, when I came to Caracas, I lived close to that statue also. I said, well, close to that statue, there's one particular high-rise building that's kind of unique. It has 2-story apartments while all the other apartment buildings are single-story. He said, you know, that's interesting. I lived in one just like that also. I said, well, in this particular building, which was unique in Caracas, we rented from a lady who was Colombian, and her name was Estella. And he said, you know, the renter or the owner of the apartment I lived in was also by the name of Estella. She was Colombian. We were sitting on an airplane next to a Chinese man that had slept in the very same bed in the very same bedroom in a 6 million person city, and we were now headed to Florida together. I had to go to the bathroom at that time. I got up and went down the hallway and came back to my seat. I thought I'll just go down the track a little bit further. And I said, well, sir, what brings you to the airplane and why are you headed out of the country? And at that particular time in Venezuelan politics, the government was trying to overtake the educational system. And so he said, we're trying to check out some options for our daughters to study abroad. We have some family members living here in Florida. I'm going to go see them. And I said, well, we're bringing our daughter to come up and check out some colleges. We're going to stop first in a city north of Miami. He said, how are you going to get there? I said, well, we're going to get on a train when we get off the airport in Miami. We'll just run up on the train. He said, well, listen, I'm renting a car and I'm going that direction. I'll just take you guys. Oh, sir, we wouldn't want to bother you in that way. He said, no, I would rather you go. So we got in this rental car with a Chinese man that we had just met on the plane where we had slept in the same bed back in Caracas. And we're driving towards this university up in north of Miami. On the way up, I began to share more about my faith and the important role that Christ had in my life. And our daughter was sharing the same, and we're just trying to seek God's will on where we should go next. And as we get closer to the town, I realized I only had directions to get to our destination by the train. I didn't know how to get there from the interstate, and it was almost 2 hours north of Miami. We got closer to the city, and I noticed that there were going to be multiple exits to get off, and we had no clue which exit to take, so we just randomly selected one exit, drove over towards the city, got to one road that looked like it was headed north, maybe closer to our destination. We took that road, and as the civilization began to dissipate, I thought we better stop and ask directions. I saw a person on the side of the street. I said, sir, let's just ask this person, where is West Palm Beach University? We he stopped the car. I got out and asked the person, and they said, if you would just look at the building a half a block ahead, read what it says on the side of the building. We were a half a block away from West Palm Beach University. We drove the next half a block, and I looked at the campus. There were cars everywhere. There was no place to park. I said, sir, we better stop one more time. Let me just do a real quick run around this lawn here, and I'll find a parking place, and I'll signal. And as soon as I got out of the car, I realized I can't leave this Chinese man on the street. It was a 6-lane avenue, and he was going to block up traffic. We would get a parking ticket. I said, well, let's get out of here. Let's go find someplace. So we started to mosey back through a lawn and back into a parking lot that just happened to have 2 or 3 places empty at that time of the afternoon. And as we moseyed our way into the first place we could find, we got closer and closer to the post at the end of the parking lot, and it said reserved for Deshae Linn, our daughter. We looked at each other and our mouths dropped to the floor. And I said, sir, we're supposed to do a tour here of this university. Would you like to stay with us and see the tour? He said, sure, I'd love to see the campus. We stayed and saw the campus, and after the tour, I said, we just can't thank you enough for giving us transportation up here. Maybe this college will be good for you and your daughter sometime in the future, but we would like to take you out to eat. So would you be kind enough to join us for lunch? And he said, I'd be happy to. And guess where we ate? A Chinese restaurant. And I went to take the bill when we had finished eating at this all-you-can-eat buffet, and the Chinese man dropped the hand down of the waiter and said, I'm taking this bill. And in spite of my insistence that I wanted to honor him by paying for the meal, he paid for this restaurant. We went back to the campus, got the things out of the car, and I insisted one more time, sir, please take this money for the gas and all the time that you've just spent investing into us. And he refused. He would not take that money. He was looking for a place where his daughters could study. Sunday afternoon, we had lunch with our Chinese friend again back in Venezuela. I think we have a picture of them on the screen. A week after we got back from Florida on that trip, he found the Christian International School in Venezuela where our daughters were studying, as well as our son. And that fall, his daughters began studying at the Christian International School of Caracas. He had told me in the car that day that he was an agnostic. He really didn't believe in God. But he told me Sunday, I have never had an experience like that shook my belief system to the very core. And for the last 4 years, his family has been very heavily involved in the Christian school of Caracas while his daughters are coming to meet the Lord of the universe. He has one pastime that he loves from the United States: race car driving. And guess where we live? The Indianapolis 500. This story continues. It is a small world when the Lord is God. But it's also not just a small world where the Lord is God. The world gets smaller as God works out his redemptive purposes. In Acts chapter 8, you might remember that a phenomenal thing was happening as the early church was exploding and expanding. Philip, one of the men who had been charged with the oversight of a new ministry to the Grecian widows, had separated from that post and was called to go up into Samaria due to the persecution. And in a divine moment, the Holy Spirit asked him to leave a very highly successful evangelistic campaign where multitudes were turning to Christ. God was confirming the work with miracles, signs, and wonders, and demons were being cast out of the people. And in the midst of that incredible, successful campaign, God told Philip, I want you now to leave this campaign and go out to the isolated desert road headed down to Gaza. It didn't make sense, but Philip obeyed and went down the desert road. And there, as he traveled along the desert road, a one in which perhaps you have been asked to travel, Suddenly he saw a chariot. A man from Ethiopia who happened to be reading the Bible. The Spirit said to get close to the chariot, and you know the rest of the story, the conversion, and how that man would be the first convert sent into Ethiopia with the good news of the gospel. I can hear Philip saying as he was taken away from that place, man, what a small world. I've thought about that recently, and we are transitioning temporarily in the States as our children are moving into the latter stages of high school and into college. There in Indianapolis, one of our new assignments has been to work with the International Student English Center off the campuses of IUPUI. The first class that I had the opportunity to teach had students from two countries. From Saudi Arabia, a country that only through very creative entrance modes can missionary be work done within the country, and the country of Venezuela. We quickly made friends with the Venezuelans and began to befriend the Saudi Arabian students. And I think we have another slide of that first class, the mixture of the two. We become better and better friends with our student friends from Saudi Arabia. Of course, if you've studied Islam, you'll know that that's the birthplace of Islam. And not only is it the birthplace, but it is also the Mecca of all activity for the Muslim world. It is illegal to distribute Bibles. It's illegal to talk about Jesus Christ or to share our faith in that country, but they're coming to us and we become wonderful friends. And in the more recent days, my wife has been asked to be the tutor for several of the Saudi Arabian women. We've exchanged meals in their homes, and they've come to our home and done the same. And just 2 weeks ago, we had the opportunity to give the Bible to one of her students after supper. You'll see on the next slide, Amal and Hamad and their small child. And as she received the Bible for the first time in her life, she said, I have always wanted to read this book. It is a small world when God works out his redemptive purposes. Several years back, I was coming back from prayer meeting at the church we've been serving in Venezuela. It was a Thursday night. It was late. I had a carload of people that needed to get home. I took them into the neighboring town before making the long drive up into Caracas. I recognized on the manifold in front of my steering wheel that I wasn't going to make it to Caracas unless I drove by the gas station. There was only one gas station open in town, and so I figured I better take advantage. But as I drove into the station, I noticed it was very dark, and it was a dangerous area of town, and I better move quickly. So I pulled up to the tank, started to fill the tank up with gasoline, and as I'd gotten out of the car, I noticed that there were some undesirables sitting behind me on a cement bench, a curbing. Well, I quickly began to fill up the tank with gasoline, and as I was standing there filling up the tank, suddenly I heard what I didn't want to hear. David. David. And I thought to myself, I didn't hear anything. I'm going to keep on pumping gas. I listened as I was pumping the gas, and just a few moments later, once again, David, David. Well, I had to turn around, and I looked down, and there was a desperate-looking man behind me sitting on the curb who looked up at me, and he said, Pastor David, ¿te acuerdas de mí? Do you remember me? I said, well, help me out. He said, 12 years ago, when you guys were starting that church up in Caracas in the cinema in Chacaito, I went there occasionally. The custodian of that cinema was one of my best friends, and we conversed several times after church. I'm here tonight looking for a ride to get back up to Caracas and catch a bus back out to my home 12 hours away. Well, what can I do to help? Can I help you? Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, could you give me a lift to Caracas? Well, I put him in the car, and I said, as we were driving away, on this 30-minute trek up to Caracas where there was virtually no lights. So what brings you here? He said, well, I just got out of jail this morning. Oh, So what happened? He said, well, 12 years ago, in my home state, 12 hours away, I was accused of murdering my neighbor's wife. And it was a massacre. It was an ugly thing. I've been in jail these past 12 years, in prison. Yesterday morning, the chaplain of the prison, and by the way, I think you might know him, he mentioned your name, John Bryce, prayed that as I was dismissed from prison, that I would find the way to get back home. And here we were, riding with an assassin or potential assassin in my dark car the 30 minutes back up to Caracas. Had the privilege to buy him something to eat, get his bus fare, and send him back home as God continued to pursue that man with his redemptive purposes in mind. It is a small world when the Lord is working out his redemptive purposes. But I suppose that perhaps you already know that it's a small world when the Lord is God. And perhaps you are well aware that it gets smaller when the Lord is working out his redemptive purposes. But my bigger concern this morning is not that you're aware of those two things, but perhaps it's a fear that I have. And the fear that I have is simply this. My concern is that perhaps your world has gotten too small. Too small. What do I mean by that? Going into the book of Jonah, and we'll close here this morning into the book of Jonah, that was precisely his problem. Jonah was running from God, and as he ran, his world kept getting smaller and smaller. So long as Jonah ran, his world got tinier and tinier until the options ran out, and he found himself soaking in the stomach acids of a great fish. From Jonah's uncomfortable small place, he offers up a prayer, and it's recorded for us in Jonah chapter 2. Now, I've gone ahead of you just for a moment, and in the next 3 slides, I would like for you to look at the slides that contain the content of his prayer and see if you don't find a common denominator in this prayer. Look at slide 1 briefly. Move on to slide 2 as you read through that prayer ever so quickly, and move on to the final segment, slide 3 of his prayer. What do you see as the common denominator in that prayer? Who's that prayer about? Do you notice it? What's the common pronoun in the prayer? Help me out. I, me, and mine. Jonah's problem was the problem that many of us have. Self-centeredness, ethnicity. Growing up in a world where we think it's all about us. My home, my culture, my people are the most important. And God was rattling the foundations of his self-centered life. As a matter of fact, the great fish was so disgusted with his selfish prayers, he vomits him out on dry ground, and his prayers reflect what he wanted to happen as opposed to God's agenda in the world. Ultimately, God's world or God's way leads us out of our small worlds into the big world because his plan is all about them and not about us. The greatest obstacle to discharging the missionary mandate in Jonah wasn't the sailors, nor the fish, nor the king. Not even the people of Nineveh were an obstacle. The biggest obstacle was Jonah himself. the missionary. God's calling on our lives is always about others and not about us. And Jonah's obstacle is an obstacle that perhaps every one of us must overcome, living in too small of a world. And I relate so well because I've lived there too. Let me just close briefly this morning by sharing quickly how God began to work us out of the small world. Reminded me that my own backyard wasn't big enough. After going to Christian college and halfway through the college, God gave me the first ministry assignment into another area of the Midwest, a small town, another state, another environment altogether. And I've often joked with my wife when God placed us there, we went through more culture shock in that first ministry assignment than we've ever, on any international mission assignment we've ever been in. They had no indoor plumbing. Everybody worked the tobacco fields. They worked in the stripping rooms, and it was a new culture for me. They didn't have Friday night football, and that was something that was just devastating to my raising up. But we found in that new world that there were some wonderful, wonderful people who were investing into our lives. And as I began to share the word and what God was teaching me, reading through the book of Acts and being perhaps much more inspired and challenged by what I was finding in the book of Acts than anybody who was sitting in that church, I began to find that there was a God that was calling us to a bigger world than what I knew. I asked my wife several different times, honey, what would you think if we just took a short-term trip to another part of the world? And she always responded with this wonderful answer, honey, why don't you just go and come back and tell me all about it? I said that 2 or 3 different times and got the same response. And one Saturday when her guard was a little bit low, I happened to mention, why don't we go to an orientation for a for a short-term trip to Caracas, Venezuela, and we can just go and there's no commitment and we'll just hear the information, we can come back and we don't have to commit to anything. And we did go to that weekend orientation, came back, and we were wrestling through the issues, and I decided maybe a good time to pop the question one more time. And so I said, honey, what would you think if we tried to do a summer trip? She said, why don't you just go and come back and tell me all about it? That day, my college football team had just got smeared by another team. It was raining profusely on the highway, and my wife had just told me no. It was one of the worst days of my life. And as we drove into the small parsonage where we had our living quarters, that evening I said, honey, one more time, we're kind of at a crossroads in our life, or we're not going to spend the rest of our lives here. Why don't we just ask God? I know in the depths of your heart that you want to do God's will, and I want to do God's will. And if you would consider, how about if we just pray tonight, if God wants us to go to this country next year, let's ask God to wake us up at 3 in the morning. 3 would mean that you and me and God are part of this. And if God doesn't want us to go, let's ask him to wake us up at 2. And 2 would mean that you and I are thinking about something in which God has no part. And to eliminate any shadow of doubt, and I want to invite my wife to come up and finish the last line of this. If God doesn't want us to go, let's ask God to wake us up at 2:22. And if he does want us to go, let's ask him to wake us up at 3:33. And we had one of the most meaningful prayer times we've ever had as a couple that night, there beside our bed and placing our lives before the Lord. And after we prayed, we went to sleep, and I want my wife to share the ending.
We lived in a very rural area of the country, and I think we only had cows for neighbors, and it was very quiet. And we went on to sleep that night after having a really special prayer time. And what David said is true. I really wanted to do what God wanted us to do, but he just hadn't told me that yet. And so we went on to sleep, and in the middle of the night, I find myself staring into the darkness in the ceiling, and I thought, why am I awake? And I realized that I didn't think I had to go to the bathroom, and like any person, you want to know how much time you have left to rest. And so I leaned my head over, and I couldn't see the clock because his head was right there. And so I lifted up my head, and our little alarm clock said 3:33. At that moment, I realized that the God of the universe had spoken to me. And he had said, "You don't need to worry. I'm already there. I'm going to take care of you. You just need to be faithful and trust me." And I started elbowing David, and I said, "David, wake up. Look at the clock. Look at the clock." And when he woke up, he saw the clock turn from 3:33 to 3:34, and that's when I spoke after a minute or so of silence, and I said, I think God wants us to do this. And the night before we left, the last check came in that put us way over the amount of money that we were going to need for the 3 months. And we went to Venezuela in 1986. And when we got on the plane to come back, we knew we weren't coming back here to stay. He wanted us there. And there are no regrets. He's a great God.
It is a small world when the Lord is God. And it gets smaller as God works out his redemptive purposes. But please, don't let your world be too small.